This video is sponsored by Dev Mountain. If you're interested in learning web development, iOS, or UX design, Dev Mountain is a 12-week design and development bootcamp intended to get you a full-time position in the industry. To learn more, visit devmountain.com or click the link in the description below. Hey guys, welcome to my Node.js crash course. So in this video, we're going to be talking about what Node is, and we'll jump in and take a look at some of the fundamental modules, some of the functionality that Node.js includes. We're going to build a web server with just Node itself. It's important to know that we're not going to be using Express or any other framework or anything like that. This course will be followed with an Express crash course, but far too many tutorials on Node include Express, and it's important to know that they're different. Node is a runtime, Express is a framework that's often used with Node. So I want to touch on some of the core Node modules. At the end, I'll even show you how to deploy Node to Heroku, which is an app hosting platform. So we'll look at some slides and then we'll jump in and we'll start exploring Node.js. Alright, so first off, what is Node? It's a JavaScript runtime, as I mentioned. It's not a language, it's not a framework or a library or anything like that. The language is JavaScript, only instead of JavaScript running in a browser environment, as it has run traditionally, it's actually running on your machine as a service or a runtime. It does this by using the V8 JavaScript engine, which is the same engine that the Google Chrome browser uses. It's very powerful, it's very fast. Node and V8 is, they're mostly written in C++, which is an extremely powerful and fast low-level language. So essentially what all this means is we can use JavaScript as a server-side language, just like we could Python, PHP, C# or any other programming language. So what should you know before learning Node? I would definitely recommend that you learn at least the basics of JavaScript, objects, arrays, conditionals, all that good stuff. I would also suggest learning some of the newer features, ES6+, like arrow functions, promises, etc. Now, since you're dealing with server-side, you're going to be dealing with HTTP quite a bit, as you'll be getting requests from the client to your server and then sending back a response. And of course, frameworks like Express make this much easier, but nevertheless, you should still understand, for instance, the important HTTP codes, like what is a status 200, a 404, a 500, etc. Maybe even learn about HTTP headers, things like that. So Node is also used a lot for REST APIs and microservices, which 99% of the time they're going to be serving JSON as the content type or the data type. So I would suggest learning JSON, which is actually very simple. You could probably learn it in a couple days if you don't already know it. And that's pretty much it. Maybe the MVC pattern, the model view controller pattern, which is used pretty commonly with Node, but again, it's just a plus. It's not something you have to know before you start learning Node. All right, so why use Node? Why is it a good choice for server-side technology over, let's say, PHP or Python? So Node is extremely fast, efficient, and it's also highly scalable. And one of the reasons for that is it's event-driven and it runs on a single loop and it's non-blocking. Okay, so it has a non-blocking I/O model, and if that sounds like gibberish, I'm going to go over what that means a little bit more in the next couple slides. So Node is also very popular in the industry, especially in startups. There's a lot of full stack jobs out there looking for people that know Node. I'm sure many of you have heard of the mean stack or the MERN stack. Node is often used with front-end frameworks like React, Vue, and Angular because it allows you to use the same language on both sides. So rather than having a JavaScript front end and then like a C# or Python back end, you have the same language on both the front end and back end, which can be an advantage. All right, so as I mentioned, Node.js is non-blocking and it's asynchronous, okay? It works on a single thread and it uses non-blocking I/O or input-output calls. So something like PHP is usually synchronous and it runs on multiple threads. So every time a request is made, it spawns a new thread, and these threads, they take up system memory and can eventually max out, okay? Can max out whatever the memory load handles. So since these languages are synchronous, it has to essentially sit and wait for one process to complete before starting the next. Now, Node.js, on the other hand, works in an asynchronous way, and it's non-blocking on a single thread. And this single thread can literally support tens of thousands of connections, which are held in what's called an event loop. And this optimizes throughput and scalability in applications with many I/O operations. Where you don't want to use Node is with CPU-intensive apps, so long-running calculations, things like that. All right, so here is a diagram of the event loop and how it works. So it runs on a single thread, and events are run asynchronously. Basically, when an event is triggered, a callback fires. So this way the system doesn't have to run a process, sit and wait for it to end, and then run the next like it does in many other synchronous languages. It simply fires an event or a process and moves on, and once that event is fulfilled, it runs in the loop. And you don't have to understand this completely to be able to start to work with Node and write Node.js applications. I just wanted to kind of summarize a little bit how this works, and because it's the reason that Node is so fast and efficient. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what types of projects Node is good for. So, I mean, the short answer is anything that's not CPU intensive, right? So, I/O operations are asynchronous, and usually that is, for instance, making a request to a server, sending data to a server, getting a response, things like that. Those are I/O operations. However, running, CPU calculations, that can block the whole server and can make that application very slow. So it's not really good for those types of things. So like REST APIs and microservices, Node is great for. A lot of times you'll be building a back-end API with Node where you won't even be serving, for instance, HTML pages. You'll be serving JSON. You'll do all your database interaction and stuff like that within Node.js. And obviously it works with any database. You can use relational databases. However, it's very popular. MongoDB is very popular to use with Node because it's very fast. It's also very scalable. So Node and Mongo actually make a really good team. Real-time services, so things like chat applications, Node is great for. CRUD apps, so blogs, shopping carts, social networks, basically any application where you're just fetching stuff from the database, displaying it, you're updating the database, things like that, Node is great for as well. Also tools and utilities, as long as they're not CPU intensive. So these are all things that Node is fantastic for. All right, so when you download and install Node.js, you get something called NPM, which is the Node Package Manager. And it's used to install third-party packages or modules, such as frameworks, libraries, and smaller tools. And when you install a package, it gets stored in a folder called node_modules, which will be created automatically when you install something. And then any package or dependency you install will get listed in a file called package.json, which every Node project should include. It holds info about your app, like the name, the version, and it also lists all the dependencies, which are packages that your app needs to be able to run. Okay, you can also create NPM scripts to run certain tasks, such as web servers, and we're going to be looking into all of this stuff a little later. I do have an entire crash course on NPM where I go deep into all the commands and stuff like that if you're interested. Some common commands, we have npm init, which generates the package.json file, and then if we want to install something, we simply do npm install, and then whatever it is we want to install. In this case, it's Express, which is a very popular web framework. Now, this will install it locally in your application folder. However, you can also install things globally on your system by just adding the -g flag. Okay, so that'll put it on your system so that you can run the commands or whatever it includes. You can run that anywhere in your system. All right, so modules are a huge part of Node. Node has a large set of core modules that it comes with. We're going to be looking at a bunch of the common ones. You also have modules or packages that you install with NPM, and then you can also create your own modules, which are simply files that have an export. Okay, this way you can include variables, functions, classes, or anything else from one file. You can include that in another. And we're going to do this. We're going to look at the syntax. Basically, you create a variable, you set it to require whatever module you want. In this case, it's the path module, which is a Node core module. And then if you want to create your own file and bring it in, you can simply add it to create a variable, require, and then set the path of the file. So in this case, // just means that there's a myfile.js file in the same folder. Okay, so I think that's enough for the talk and the slides. Let's go ahead and jump in and let's start working with Node.js. All right, so the very first thing that you need to do, obviously, is install Node.js. So you need to go to nodejs.org and either download the long-term support version or the current, which is the latest version with the latest features. I usually download the current, but it doesn't matter. Whichever one you want to use should be fine. So I'm just going to open up a terminal real quick, or if you're on Windows, you can open up your command line, your command prompt. And I just want to show you, before we jump into a text editor and we start creating files, I want to show you that Node comes with something called a REPL, which is a read, eval, print loop. And it basically allows us to run JavaScript directly in the console. So if we just type in Node, well, first of all, just make sure you have it installed with node -- version. And you can see you'll also have npm as well. All right, but if we go ahead and we just say Node and that's it, and we hit enter, it'll bring us into the REPL. And from here, we can actually type in JavaScript. So for instance, we can say 1 + 1, and it'll give us 2. We can create variables. So I'll say const name equals a string of Brad, and it'll give me back undefined just because that statement doesn't return anything. But if I go ahead and type in name, you'll see it gives me Brad. I can also do a console.log name, and you'll see it will just log Brad. All right, we can also create functions. So if I say like function hello, and let's just have it, actually we'll just say return hello, and then we'll just concatenate on name. So we'll create that function, and now if I say hello, I can run that function. All right, so I just wanted to show you that we can in fact run JavaScript from the console if we have Node installed. However, this isn't something that at least I use pretty much ever, but it is possible. So let's just Control C or Command C just to get out of that. All right, so I'm going to close up the terminal and head into VS Code, and from now on I'm going to be using my integrated terminal down here. And I have a folder open which is empty. It's called Node Crash Course, and this is where I'll be creating all my files. So the first thing that you're going to want to do usually when you're creating anything with Node is create a package.json file. And you don't have to create it manually. You can simply run npm init. And it's going to, by default, just ask us some questions like the package name. So I'll keep the folder name as the default. The version, hit enter, that's good. Description, let's say Node Crash Course. Entry point is basically your main file. By default, it's index.js, but I've also seen app.js, server.js. Those are some other common file names. Test command, we don't need that. Git repository, author, you can put your name, and then license default is ISC, that's fine. And then we'll hit enter, and it will create a package.json with all that stuff in it. All right, now the biggest purpose of package.json, well, I shouldn't say the biggest purpose, but one of the main purposes is to store all your dependencies. If your application uses something you install from npm, then it needs to be listed here, because if you move to another computer, another server, whatever it may be, where you want to run your app, you're going to run npm install, and that's going to install all the packages that are listed. All right, so later on I'm going to be using a very small module called UUID just to generate random IDs. So I'll install that now just to show you. If I do npm install UUID, so as you can see over here, it created a node modules folder and it was put inside of there. And if I reload my package.json, you can see it gets added as a dependency. Okay, now you can also have dev dependencies, which are dependencies that you just need for development. So we're going to be using something called nodemon, which will make it so that we don't have to keep restarting our server. And I want to install that as a dev dependency. So I could say npm install, and I could either do -- save -dev, and then the name of the module, which is nodemon. But what I like to do is just $D, which is a shorter way of doing it. So if we go ahead and run that, it should get added as a dev dependency. All right, so now right here you can see dev dependencies and we have nodemon. So when you're ready to deploy or move this app somewhere else, you don't include the node modules. You can delete that and then just run npm install. Actually, I'll show you that real quick. If I were to delete this whole, and this has a lot of stuff in it now because it has all the dependencies of these modules and then any dependencies that those have. So this folder gets huge. So you never want to deploy this to a host. If I delete this and I have these listed in my package.json, I can simply do npm install, and it's going to then recreate the node modules folder with all that stuff in it. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and we'll use those modules later. I just wanted to show you that. So let's create our main file, which is index.js, and and by the way, it also created a package-lock JSON. This just tracks all of our dependencies with the versions. And by the way, everything that we install comes from the npmjs.org repository or website. That's where everything is stored in that registry. All right, so in index.js, I'm just going to simply do a console.log. And let's just say hello from Node.js and save. Now I can run this file by simply saying node index.js, and it prints it out in the terminal, in the console. And when we run a file, we don't actually have to put .js, so just node index, that'll do the same thing. All right, so we can run any JavaScript we want from the terminal or any JavaScript file. Now, most of the time you're going to have multiple files, and these other files are basically modules. You're going to create, whether it's a class or a function or an object or something that you're going to export to bring into another file. So I want to touch on that. So let's create a new file. We'll just call this person.js. And inside here, let's go ahead and create an object called person, and we'll set this object to have a name of John Doe, and let's say age 30. Now if I want to use this person object somewhere else, I can simply say module.exports equals person. Okay, and if I save that and I go back to index.js and I want to bring that in, I can simply create a variable, I'll call it person, and set it to require. And then since it's a file and not an actual module that we installed or a core node module, we want to put the path, which is /, meaning the current folder, and then person. And then I'll go ahead and console.log person. All right, and then we're going to run node index, and you'll see that it'll give us that object. Obviously, if I wanted just the name, I could do person.name, and we get John Doe. Okay, now a lot of times you'll have a class, or you could have a function that you could export, but let's say we wanted a class in this file called person, and we'll create a constructor, and this is just a JavaScript class, an ES6 class. I'm not going to go over JavaScript syntax. That's not what this video is about. It's about Node specifically, so I'm not going to explain every little bit of JavaScript. But let's say this takes in a name and an age, and we set this dot name to name and this dot age to the age that's passed in, and we'll create a method called greeting. And let's go ahead and let's do a console log. We'll put some backticks in here, and we'll say my name is, put our variable syntax, and we can say this dot name, and I am this dot age. Okay, and then we'll go down here, and let's make sure we change this to an uppercase P. We're exporting the whole class, and we'll save that, and let's bring in person uppercase P, and now we can instantiate a person from it, a person object. So we'll say person1 equals new person, pass in John Doe and 30, and let's go ahead and run person1 dot greeting. So now if I run this node index file, you'll see my name is John Doe and I am 30. Okay, so we exported the person class and we brought it in, and we instantiated a person and then called the greeting method. Now it might seem like this file here is just getting run directly like this, but actually when you include a module like this, it's wrapped in what's called a module wrapper function. And I'm just going to paste this in just to show you. We don't want to run this code. This is actually wrapped around all of this. So we have access to module, require, exports, also the file name and dir name, okay, double underscore file name and dir name. And we're using module.exports down here. We can also use require to bring things in. And we also have access to these two. And just to prove that to you, I'll go ahead and say console.log. Let's do, we'll do dir name and file name. Okay, I'm just going to comment that out because that'll give us an error. And if we run node index, you'll see before we get the output of the greeting, we get this, which is the dir name. Okay, it's just the full directory of this file. And then the file name includes the full directory as well as the name of the file, which is person.js. Okay, not index because we didn't run this in index. We ran it in person.js. Okay, so just wanted to show you that those are available because we'll be using this dir name and file name later on. And that's where it comes from. All right, so let's go ahead and close that up. I think that's pretty much it as far as exporting and requiring. Now, you might be wondering why we're not doing like import person from person like we would in, like, let's say React or anything ES6, and that's because Node hasn't implemented this yet. If you want to be able to use this syntax, for now you have to implement Babel to compile it, to compile to ES6. This is the last feature really of ES6 that isn't perfected in Node yet, and I'm hoping that this is available soon, that we can do this. But just to show you, if we try this and we run node index, it's going to give us an error, unexpected identifier. Okay, so yeah, we can't do that just yet, but hopefully soon. So, and by the way, this is called common.js. This method of module is common.js. The other way that I just showed you is ES6. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of Node's core modules. Now, if we go back to the Node.js website, we go to docs, and we're using version 11. This will give us all the core modules, as you can see on the left here, as well as documentation on some other stuff. But let's take a look at the path module, which is used quite often. It's basically used to work with file directories, files and directory paths, as you can see. And the documentation for these modules is really good because it has all the different methods that are available. So for instance, base name shows you the parameters that it takes, shows you what it returns, it shows you an example. So this is very helpful. And I'm just going to go over some of these. I'm not going to go over every single method of all of these modules, but just some stuff that you might run into. So let's jump back into VS Code, and these are basically going to be for reference. So I'm going to create a new folder called reference because I want you guys to be able to have this if you want to go back and look at some of these methods. So I'm going to create a file in here called path_demo.js, and we're going to want to run this file. So I'm going to cd into reference, and then to run this we can say node path demo, which obviously right now isn't going to do anything because there's nothing in it. So let's bring in the path module. So we can say require path, and it's a core module, so we don't have to include like a file path or anything. We don't have to npm install path because it's already included with Node. So let's take a look at some of the methods. So first one is base name. Actually, I'll put what it does. So it gets the base file name. And remember, if we do a console log of _file name, what that gives us is the entire path and the file name at the end. So what path.basename does is it'll just give us the file name. So if we wrap this in path.basename, and we go ahead and run this, you'll see we just get path demo.js. So there'll be, you know, if you're working with files, you'll probably have cases where you're going to have to dissect parts of it, and this will get you the base name. Now, if you want just the directory name, we can do that as well. So we can say console log path.dir name, and then let's pass in the file name, which includes the path and the file name, and that will give us just the directory, which in this case dir name _dir name will give us the same thing, but this way we're using the path module to get this. Okay, so we can also get the extension, and we'll actually be using quite a bit of this stuff later when we create our HTTP server. But let's say file extension. So if we do path.ext, and you'll see in VS Code, as soon as I put a dot, it shows us all the available methods. So we'll do ext name, and let's pass in our file name. And now if we run this, you can see that it gives us .js. Okay, so it's just going to give you whatever the extension is. You can also create an object with different parts of the path. So let's say create path object, and we do this with the parse method. So let's do console log path.parse and pass in our file name and see what that gives us. And it gives us this object with the root, directory, base, extension, and name, which is the file name without the extension. And we can access any part. Since this is an object, we can access any property. Like let's say we want the base, we could say .base, and it just gives us just that base right here, just that value. All right, and then the last thing I want to show you is join. So this will, I can't talk while I spell concatenate. So concatenate paths, and we use join for this. So let's say we want to create like the current directory /test/hello.html. Let's say we wanted that. So we could say path.join, and it's just going to put together each parameter we pass in. So we'll take the dir name, which gives us the current directory, and let's say we want to then do test. Okay, so a folder called test, and then a file called hello.html. Okay, so let's get rid of this, and let's see what this does, what this gives us. So we'll clear this up and run the file, and you'll see we get the directory name, so that's the first part, and then /test, which is this part, and then hello HTML. Now this works really well when you have issues with delimiters. Basically, with Windows, you have different delimiters. Sometimes you'll have this the backslash, and then on Mac and Linux you'll have the /, and this will put the correct delimiter in, which usually resolves itself. But I have ran into some cases where it doesn't. So it's good to use this path.join, and we'll be using this later on. Now there are a lot of other methods that you can use with the path module here, but I'm not going to go over all of them. I don't want to waste too much time here. So the next thing I want to look at is the file system module, or the FS module. So in reference, I'm going to create a file called fs_demo.js, and we're going to bring in here fs, so require fs, and we're also going to bring in path again because we're going to be using that as well. All right, and first thing I'm going to show you is how to create a folder. Okay, so this will create a folder on our system, and we're going to say fs.makedir. Now, by default, these are asynchronous, and let me just show you what I mean. So if we go to, let's see, file system, and this shows us all the different methods, and if we go to makedir, you'll see that there is makedir, which is the one we're using, which is asynchronous, which means that it takes in a callback. Okay, so anything you want to do after, you put in your callback, However, there is a synchronous version of most of these methods. So as you can see, there's make_dir sync, which does not take in a callback. So basically, if you use the synchronous version, you'll wait until the process is complete until it moves on. With the asynchronous, you can call it and then just, you know, keep going and it'll finish in the callback. So it's asynchronous. So in most cases, you're going to want to use the asynchronous version. However, I wanted to show you there is a synchronous version. So like I said, this takes in the folder you want to create. So I'm actually going to create a folder called test inside our current directory. So I'm going to take the path module and use join, and let's join the current directory name, and then let's add a folder called test. Okay, so that's what we want to create. The second parameter of make_dir is options, and we don't have any, so I'm just going to put an empty object and then a callback. So we can say like function, and this will take in a possible error, and we can check for that error, and if there is one, then we can throw that error in the console. And then we'll just do a console.log, and we'll say folder created. All right, now you can do it this way with function, but I like to use arrow functions, so I'm going to get rid of that, the function text, and then just put an arrow. And since I only have one parameter of error, I don't actually need to use parentheses here. So I'm going to save this, and let's go ahead and run node fs_demo. So we get folder created, and if we look in our reference folder, we now have a folder called test. Okay, so that'll create a folder. Now we can also create files, and there's a method called open that you can use to create a file. However, if you want to write to it right away, you can use write file, and that will create it and write to it. So let's go ahead and say create and write to file. So let's actually copy this, because all of these are pretty similar. They're all asynchronous. So instead of make directory or make_dir, we're going to use write file. And for the path, let's do same thing, current directory test, and we'll create a file called hello.txt. Okay, so it just takes in a path to a file that you want to create, not txt. And then the second parameter is going to be the content that you want to write. So let's just say hello world. And then this will give us back a possible error. We'll check for it. If nothing goes wrong, then we'll just say file written to. All right, so we'll save that. I do have the prettier extension in VS Code, so it just formatted it a little bit. So let's go ahead and run this. Whoops, what did I do here? File already exists. Oh, because we're trying to create a folder here that already exists, so I'm going to comment that out. However, it did run this, and it did create the hello.txt, and if we look inside, actually, I guess, you know what, let's try to run that again. All right, so it's looking hello text, and now we get hello world. All right, now let's say we wanted to add to it, like hello world, and then we'll say, I love Node.js. Now, if I were to copy this and put this down here and change this to space, I love Node.js, let's see what happens. So we're going to run both of these write files. Okay, you can see it was file written to is here twice, but if we look inside, it just says I love Node.js, because what write file does is it overwrites whatever's already in there. If you want to append to it, then you want to use append file. So let's change this to append file, and then since I want to run both of these together, and this is asynchronous, we're going to take this whole thing and put this inside the callback. Okay, so we'll put that right here, and let's say file append, and save. And now what I'll do is just delete the hello text altogether so it recreates it. Okay, so write file should recreate it. It should add hello world, and then in the callback we're running append file, which should add I love Node.js. So let's try it. Let's make sure that's saved. We'll run it, creates the file, and if we take a look, it says hello world space I love Node.js. All right, so that's write file and append file. Now if we want to read file, we can do that as well. Let's just comment this stuff out. And let's say read file. And I'm just going to copy this. Okay, so read file. And the file we want to read is going to be the hello text. So I'm just going to add in here hello.txt. And let's see. For the second parameter of read file, you're going to want to put the character encoding, which is going to be UTF-8. If you don't put this and you want to get the data that's in the file, it's just going to give you a raw buffer. It's not going to give you the actual data. Since we put the encoding, we can actually put after the possible error the data that's in the file, and let's go ahead and console log that data. And of course you could do whatever you want with the data. So let's see, that should work. Let's save this and run the file, and we get hello world I love Node.js. So it's reading what is in this text file. Okay, and then if we want to rename a file, we can do that as well. So let's change this to rename. Let's comment that out. So rename, the second parameter is going to be the path and the new file name. So I'm going to copy this whole path.join and put that as a second parameter. And let's change the name of the file to, we'll just say hello world, I guess. Okay, and then it'll give us a possible error. And then let's just console log file renamed. Oops, we need quotes. All right, so let's save that. Run it, file renamed, and now you'll see we have hello world.txt. All right, so those are just some of the things you can do with files with the FS module. Again, there's many more methods if you want to look at the documentation. And feel free to, I'll have the repository in the description. If you want to add more examples and then make a pull request, feel free to do that, just to help other people. So let's see, in reference, let's look at the OS module, which is pretty simple. So let's say new file os_demo.js. And what this does is it gives us information about our environment, about our operating system. So let's do const os equals require os. So let's say we want to get the platform, meaning Windows, Mac, whatever. So let's do console log os dot, and it has a method called platform. So let's save this and let's run node os demo, and you can see Darwin. So Darwin is the platform for Mac, okay, meaning I'm on a Mac. If you're on Windows, you get Win32. On Linux, you get, what do you get on Linux? I forget, but it's something different. So that will get us the platform. We can also get the CPU architecture. So if we do a console log os.arch, actually it's a method, so we need parentheses. We'll run that, x64, the chances are you'll get the same thing. Next we can get CPU core info. So we can get that with os.cpus. If I run that, it'll actually give us an object with information for every core of the CPU, and you can see I have quite a few here. This is an iMac Pro, which has a bunch of cores. I forget, was it like 12 cores or something like that. It's an Intel Xeon, and it just shows you all the different analytics. All right, so that's CPU core info. We can also get stuff with the information about the memory, so like the free memory. So console, and this is really cool because you can build apps that have to do with your system, you know. So let's do free mem. Oops, I'm sorry, os dot free mem. And if we run that, you'll see right here it gives us the amount of free memory, and we can also get the total memory with total mem. Run that. So here's the free memory, here's the total memory of my system. Yours will be different. We can also get, for instance, the home directory. So we can say os.home dir and run that, and you'll see that my home directory is users/Brad Traversy. And then last thing I'm going to show you is the uptime, which is the amount of time your system has been up. So let's do os.uptime. And it gives you the number of seconds that your system has been up. So, I mean, you can be creative and create some cool applications with this stuff. So I'm going to close that up. And the next thing I want to look at is the URL module. So in reference, I'm going to create a file called url_demo.js. So obviously this works with URLs. So let's do const URL equals require URL. Now, you used to use url.parse, which is now deprecated, I believe. Now you want to just instantiate a new URL object. So I'm going to say const my URL equals new URL, and then let's pass in here, let's say http my website.com. Let's do /hello.html. Let's put some parameters in here. Whoops, spelled hello wrong. So let's put some parameters in here like ID equals 100 and status equals active, because a lot of times you're going to work with URLs that have parameters like this. So first thing I want to show you how to do is get the serialized URL. So basically get the straight up URL, and we can use the object we created dot href. Okay, so we can use that property. So we'll run node URL_demo. We're running the file, and it just gives us the entire thing. You can also use the toString method, which will give you the same thing. So if we do toString like that, you'll see we get the same thing. All right, now let's say you want to just get the host or the root domain, which in our case would be mywebsite.com. So we could do my URL dot host, run that, and you'll see we get mywebsite.com. Now you can also get the host name by doing myurl.hostname. And if I run that, notice they're the same thing. The difference between this is that hostname doesn't include the port. So if we have like port 8000 like that, and we run it, notice that hostname doesn't get the port, host does. Okay, so that's the difference there. In fact, we'll just say does not get port. All right, so next let's look at the path name. So it's console log my URL dot path name. If we take a look at that, it shows /hello.html. So it just gives us the actual path, the actual file. Let's see, next we're going to look at the serialized query. So basically the straight up query parameters. So we'll do console log search. And if we take a look at that, search, whoops, my URL.search. and it gives us this. So basically everything after the question mark. Okay, now if we want to actually create an object from this, we can use search params. So let's say params object. For that, we just do my URL dot search params. Okay, so if we run that, now you can see we get an actual object with the ID and value and the status and the value. Now we can actually add parameters dynamically as well. So if we want to add param, we could say my URL dot search params dot append, and let's append, let's say ABC, and then the value 1, 2, 3. Okay, so if we do that, and then again we log the search params, let's see what that gives us. Okay, so you can see that now we've added on an extra set of parameters, so ABC and 1, 2, 3. We can also loop through these if we wanted to, so this is the last thing I'll show you guys. So to loop through the params, we could take my URL dot search params, we could do a for each, and whoops, that's not right. So this takes in a function. I'll use an arrow. I'll say value and name, and let's just do a console log, and let's put in some backticks, and we'll put the name colon and then the value. All right, so let's run that, and you can see it's going to loop through, and it's going to give us each parameter, each key value pair. All right, so that's the URL parameter. Sorry, the URL module. So next thing I want to look at is events. Okay, so using the event emitter. So if we go to the documentation and we go to events, let's see. So much of the Node core API is built around idiomatic, asynchronous, event-driven architecture in which certain kinds of objects called emitters emit named events that cause function objects or listeners to be called. So essentially we can create an event emitter, okay, an event emitter class, and then we can emit events and have listeners that listen for those events and then do something when they're fired off. So it's kind of hard to explain, so let me give you some examples. I'm going to go ahead and create in reference a new file called event_demo.js. All right, so first thing we're going to do is bring in the event emitter, and we're going to set that to require events. All right, and then we want to create an emitter class. So let's say class my emitter extends event emitter, which we just brought in. All right, and I'm not even going to put anything in here, but I'm going to go ahead and init class, or init, I should say init object. So I can say const, let's call this my emitter. Actually, we want to do, yeah, lowercase, not the same as the class, lowercase. So my emitter, and we'll set that to a new my emitter object. All right, and then what we can do is create an event listener. So we'll say my emitter dot on. So we want to say on event. Then let's put a callback, use an arrow function, and we'll just console log event fired. All right, now anytime I emit this, whatever I put in here, event, this is going to run. So if I go down here, let's say init event, and I say my emitter dot emit event, and we run node event demo, we get event fired. And if I can just run this a bunch of times, and every time I run it, it's going to run whatever is right here. All right, so what I want to do is give you a bit of a more practical example using event emitter by creating a logger. All right, so let's go ahead and close this up, and then in the root, not in the reference, but in the root, I'm going to create logger.js. And let's do the same thing by bringing in event emitter, set that to require events, and I'm also going to bring in that UUID module. Remember I installed that back in the beginning, so I'm going to say require UUID, and all UUID does is creates a random what is it? Universal? I forget what it stands for. It's a certain format of an ID. And just to show you what it gives us, let's do console log UUID. And there's different versions. So what we want to do is .version 4, and that will generate just a random ID. And I can show that to you if we cd ... back into the root and I run node logger. You'll see that this is what that generated for us. And we can generate as many as we want. So if I run that, you can see it just generates different ones. Now I want to create a class here called logger, and I want to extend event emitter. Okay, and then we'll have a method in here called log that takes in a message. Okay, and then when this is called, we want to call event or raise an event. So we're going to say this pertains to the class, right? And we're extending event emitter, which includes the emit. Okay, in our reference file here, we called myEmitter. We called myEmitter.emit. However, this method is going to call this.emit since we're extending event emitter. And let's emit an event called message, and let's add in here an ID, which we'll set to UUID.version 4, and then let's also add the MSG that we pass in. Okay, and this is the same as doing this, like that. So every time we call log, it should show a new ID with the message that's sent. Now I'm going to export this, module.exports logger. And then in the index.js, let's clear all this out. And let's bring in logger from require, whoops, what am I doing? I'm mixing ES6 and CommonJS. So const logger equals require ./logger, because remember it's a file. And then let's go ahead and create or instantiate a logger, because remember logger is a class, so we need to instantiate it. And then let's call logger.on message. Okay, now this is going to give us a callback with some data. So for this data, let's just console log, and let's say we'll say called listener, and let's put in the data as well. Actually, I'll change this to backticks. And then we'll put data. Okay, and then we actually have to call the log method. So under here, let's just say logger.log, and let's send a message. We'll just say hello world. So now let's call the index file. All right, so this is wrong. I don't know why I did this, because this is an object. This data object should be the ID in the message. So let's put quotes around call listener, and then just put a comma here, and then we'll show the data like that. Okay, so now let's run this again, and we get called listener, and it shows ID, which is a generated ID from the UUID module, and then the message that we passed in. And we can call this as many times as we want with different messages. Hi, hello, and we'll go ahead and run that, and you'll see that each time the listener is going to get called, and it's going to show a new ID with a new message. And this may not be the most practical example, but you can just see how this works. You can emit an event, and it's going to call whatever we put in here, and you could use your imagination and maybe even bring in the FS module, the file system module, and log the ID and the message to a file. Okay, so that you can just use append file, and you could have a file that has all your logs. All right, and maybe you can use that, use that as your homework assignment for this course. All right, so I want to move on because we're really running out of time here, and I want to get to the HTTP module. So we're going to create a whole server here, a very basic server, but nevertheless, it is still going to be a web server. But before we do that, I just want to, in the reference folder, create a file called http_demo.js, just so you can see the bare minimum, just to get a server running. And then we'll create the main server in our index file. So let's clear this up, and let's cd back into reference. And let's go ahead and bring in HTTP. So we want to require HTTP. All right, now we want to create a server object, and we do that by taking HTTP and calling create server. Okay, now this takes in a function. However, I'm going to use an arrow function. So I'm going to put our parameters that we need, which is request and response. Put an arrow function, and when we get a request, we want to then write a response. So we'll do res.write. Okay, it has a method called write, which basically just outputs to the browser. And let's say hello world, and then we want to end, so res.end. All right, now in order for this to run, it needs to listen on a port. So we're going to tack on to this .listen, and then this takes in a port number. I'm going to put in 5000, and then I'm just going to put a callback here to console log, and we'll just say server running, just so it shows something in the console. So server running. All right, so we'll save that, and then let's run node http_demo, and you can see server running, and we can't type anymore. So now let's go to our browser, and let's go to localhost port, so :5000, and we get hello world. Okay, so that's the most simple web server you're ever going to see in your life. Now I want to create something useful where we can actually load HTML pages, we can load, CSS files, things like that. So we're going to create an actual web server, and we're going to just close this file, and to stop the server from running, you just want to do a Control-C. Okay, and let's cd ... to get back into the root. All right, so we're done with the reference folder, so let's open up index.js. Now, it's important to know that actually, you know what, let me just take this and put this in the logger.js so you guys have this as a reference. So instead of exporting it, I'm just running it in here. Okay, so it's important to know that if you use a framework like Express, it makes this stuff a lot easier. With Express, you can say like, I want my app to receive a GET request to the page /about, and then you can have a callback function, and you can do what you want. So it makes it much easier. However, I think it's a good thing to understand how to do this without Express. At least just load basic web pages of different content types and so on. So we're going to be using all core node modules. So let's bring in HTTP. And let's also bring in path and let's bring in fs. Okay, so now we're kind of putting everything together that we've learned. So we want to create a new server object. However, I'm going to put it in a variable called server. So http dot create server, and then this is going to take in a function with request response. Now remember, we have to listen on a port. However, instead of tacking it on, we can now take that server object or variable and we can say dot listen. All right, now we want to put a port in here. However, I'm going to put the port inside of a variable. All right, now I could just set this to like 5,000. However, when we deploy this, it's not always going to run on 5,000. It's going to run on whatever, whatever our host is going to decide, which is going to be in what's called an environment variable. So it's going to be in process.env.port. Okay, but we want to do or 5,000. So basically it's going to first look for this. It's going to look for the environment variable, and then if that's not found, then it's going to run it on 5,000. Okay. Now in here we just want to put port. Okay, and then let's put a callback with a console log, and we'll put in some backticks, and we'll say server running on port, and then we'll just put in the port number. Okay, so inside here, let's I showed you how we could just we could write something out to the browser, but that's not what we want to do. We want to load a file. So I'm going to test. Let's test to see what the URL is. Now this request object, we have actually, what we'll do is let's just console log the request.url. Okay, just so we can see what that is. Now if I run my server, if I say node index, you can see server running on 5,000. If I go to port 5,000 and reload, it's going to hang because we didn't send any response. However, if we look in the console, you can see slash. Okay, so that's the request URL. Now if I were to go to, let's say, /about and go back, you'll see that we get /about. So we can see what URL is getting called. So let's do an if statement here, and we're going to make this more efficient after. I'm just doing this for an example. So let's say if request.url is equal to /, then we know that's the index page. And instead of just writing out something, like I could do, res dot, and you don't even have to do dot write and then end. You could simply do res dot end and put your content in here, and you can even put HTML in here, like let's say home. All right, so if I save that, and let's do Control-C and restart the server, and then go to localhost 5000, we get home. All right, I'm actually going to make this smaller so that we can see both at the same time. Now, if I were to change this to, let's say, home page and save and reload, notice it doesn't change because I have to go down here and manually restart the server. Now it says home page. This is where NodeMon comes in very useful. And remember, we installed that back in the beginning as a dev dependency. So this NodeMon here, we could use, let's go down here, and we could say NodeMon and then index. So instead of node, NodeMon. I'm sorry, we can't do that because we didn't install it globally. So what we want to do is create an npm script. Okay, if we did install NodeMon globally, we'd be able to do that. However, that's not the best practice. It's not what I would suggest. What we can do is go to scripts, okay, and we don't need this test script, so we can replace this. And I'm going to just do start. All right, now for start, I just want it to run the standard node index, just like we were before. However, that's not going to update unless we keep restarting the server. But the reason I'm putting it here is because once we deploy, it's going to call this start, and that's what we want. We don't want to use nodemon in deployment. So I'm going to add another script of dev, and I'm going to set that to nodemon index. So instead of just running with node, it's going to use nodemon, which constantly watches it so we don't have to update. So let's save this, clear this up, and let's say npm run dev. Okay, so we're using npm to run this script right here, which will run nodemon. Okay, and now you can see that it's running on 5000. Now if I go back to index and I change this back to home and save, nodemon is continuously watching it, so if I reload, it changes. I don't have to manually control C and restart it. Okay, so nodemon is an excellent tool. So back to our code here. Instead of doing this, I mean this, if I do a control U or whatever, what is it, control option U, and look at our source code, we have no doc type, we have nothing, we don't even have a content type. If I were to open my dev tools and go to network and take a look at, so let's make this bigger for a second, and take a look at the content type, which I don't even think it will say. Yeah, it doesn't even say, but we want this type to be HTML. So we can add a content type by saying res dot write head, so basically write to the headers, and we want this to be a 200 response, which means everything is okay, and then pass along the content type, and we want to set the content type to text/HTML. Alright, so let's save that, and now when we reload, you can see that we get status 200, and if we take a look down here, we have content type text HTML. Okay, so that you definitely want to have that in there. Now I don't want to just output the HTML here. I want to load a file. So I'm going to create a folder called public. And basically this is where I want all of the public HTML files, CSS, anything like that. So I'm going to create an index.html. And let's also create an about.html. Okay, so in index, I'm just going to generate some boilerplate and just put homepage, put an H1, we'll say welcome to the homepage, and then we'll copy this, we'll go to about, change the title to about, and we'll just change this to about. Alright, so we have two HTML pages in the public folder, which right now they're not getting loaded in any way, they're just there. So what I want to do is, if the request URL is / I want to load the home page. So I could use the FS module. I'm just going to, I'll go right above this for now. So I'll use the FS module dot read file, and let's do let's look at, actually let's use path dot join, and we'll do _dir name, and then public, and then we want to load the index HTML. Okay, and then second parameter will be our callback, and inside here is where we want to put this stuff. However, remember, when we read a file, we get first a possible error, and then we also get the data, which I'm actually going to call content. Okay, and then we'll paste that in. Okay, now when we end, we don't want to output this this H1. We want to output the content of the file. Okay, and we also want to make sure it's a status 200 and it's type HTML. So I think I have everything here. We should probably check for the error as well. But let's save that and reload, and we get welcome to the home page. Okay, so to reiterate, we're checking the URL. If it's slash, which it is, we're going to read the file index.html that's in the public folder, and we're going to then check for an error. We're going to set the status and the content type, and then we're going to simply serve the HTML page. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And then, of course, we could check for the request URL being slash about, and we could load the about page. So if we reload, we go slash about. There we go. Actually, I would probably... Oh, that's good. Now, let's say we wanted this to be like a REST API. So we wouldn't be serving HTML, we'd be serving JSON. So let's actually add in, let's change this. Let's change this to if slash API slash users. Let's get rid of this stuff. So normally what we would do is fetch data from a database and serve that. However, I'm just gonna hard code in, let's say users equals an array. So name, we'll say Bob Smith, age 40, and we'll do one more. John Doe. All right, so we have this users array, and then we would want this to be a 200 response. However, this is JSON content, so we wouldn't do text HTML, we would do application slash JSON. All right, and then we'd need to turn this object, JavaScript array of objects, into JSON. So we'll do res.end, and we would do JSON.stringify users. Okay, so let's save that. And now if I were to go to localhost 5000 /API /users, there we go, we get our JSON. Okay, so if you were to build some kind of microservice, some kind of REST API, you could do this, but you'd probably use Express or something like that. I'm just showing you how to do it with just Node. Okay, so this really isn't very efficient. Like we're gonna stick to just serving HTML files and so on. However, this isn't efficient because every single page we want to add, we would have to do, you know, if this or whatever. And also we need to be able to handle, for instance, CSS, okay, if we want to include a CSS file, or images or anything like that. So this isn't going to work. So let's comment this out because I still want you guys to have this, but let's start over. So we're going to go under all that stuff we just did. Now I want to make the file path dynamic. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to say build file path, and we're going to create a variable here called file path and set it to path.join the current directory name, and then public, and then let's say basically I want to set this to the request URL. So for instance, if we go to /about.html, then I want it to load about.html. If we go to /contact.html, I want it to look for contact.html. However, the root is a little different because it's just slash. So I'm going to use a ternary operator here. I'm going to say for request.url, if that is equal to slash, then I want to load index.html in the public folder, else, okay, colon is else, then I want request.url, whatever that is. All right, so let's actually do, let's just do res.end, just so we can see what this path is going to be. So let's do a console log of file path. All right, and we're going to just go to the root, and you'll see it's going to show anything that's sent. So even the favicon, but you can see the index HTML because this is the root. If I go to /about.html, it shows you public/about.html. So this file path is correct in terms of what we want to load. Now, we're also going to want to set the content type. Okay, like HTML has a content type of text/HTML, CSS is text/CSS, JSON is application/JSON, and so on. So what I'm going to do next, just get rid of that for now, is I want to get the extension of the file. And you guys remember how to do that, right? We do, let's create xname as a variable and set it to our path module extName method and pass in our file path. So that'll give us the extension of the file that's being loaded, okay, or being sent. Now we'll set a content type. Let's set the initial content type. So let content type is going to be by default text/HTML because that's what we mostly expect. However, we want to check the extension and then set the content type, and we'll use a switch statement for that. Okay, so let's say switch, and we want to check the extension name. All right, now I'm just going to paste these in because it's just going to take too long for me to type out. So we're basically going to check each case. So if it's JS, we want text JavaScript. If it's CSS, we want text CSS, JSON. If it's an image, that should have that content type, or I'm sorry, a PNG, it should have that. If it's a JPEG, it should have that. Okay, so that's basically all the file types that I want to handle for this server. All right, so that takes care of setting the file path and setting the content type. Now we need to actually load a file. So let's go down here, let's say read file. So we're going to do fs.read file, and we want to pass in the file path, whatever that is, and then it's going to give us error, possible error, and then let's say content. All right. Now, we didn't really go over errors, the error codes. However, we want to check for a specific type of error. And this error will be, it'll be an object that'll have a property called code. So I want to say in here, if the error.code is equal to ENOENT, okay, ENONET. And what this means is the page isn't found, okay, and in most cases that's what it's going to mean. So let's say page not found. So the way that I want to handle this, you could handle it however you want, but I want to load an error page. So in my public folder, I'm going to create a file called 404.html, and I'm just going to copy one of these HTML pages and simply say in the title not found, we'll say 404 not found. Obviously you would have this be much more stylish, it would be an actual website, but I'm just trying to show you how to create the server. So if the page isn't found, let's do fs.read file again. And you can see the reason that I went over all those modules. You guys wouldn't know what this was if I didn't go over the boring stuff earlier. So read file, we want to pass in path.join. So we want the directory name, public, and then we want to load that 404 page, so 404.html. Okay, and then the second parameter will be the callback with the error and the content. Let's actually close this up. So we have the error and the content, and then in here we want to first of all send a 200 response. So I'm going to just copy that line. So right head 200, and it's going to be text/HTML, and then we want to send the content. So let's say res.end, and let's say content, And let's specify that we want it to be UTF-8. All right, so if it's not found, it should load that. Now let's go to the end of this if right here, and let's put an else. So basically, if it's a different error, so still within the error, but if it's not this code, then it's going to be some server error, so most likely a 500. All right, so for that, we'll do a res dot write head, and we'll send a status of 500, and then let's just do a res dot end, and I'm just going to put in here server error and then the code, so error.code. Not really an elegant way to handle it, but whatever, it's fine. So now if there's no error, so at the end of this if right here, let's say else, if there's no error, then that's a successful response. So again, we'll write a 200 response, and it's going to be an HTML file, and then we just want to load the content. Okay, and the content is going to be this. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. I'll reiterate real quick. So let's start at the top, which is right here. Actually, the top is up here. We're creating a server that gets a request and response. Okay, every time a file is sent. Then we're basically gonna look in the public folder, and we're gonna evaluate whatever this is, request.url. If it's slash, we're gonna load the index. If not, we're gonna load whatever that file is called, about HTML, contact, whatever. Okay, then we're gonna get the extension, and we're going to evaluate the extension and set the content type based on that, okay? The initial being HTML. And then we're going to read the file. If there's an error, we're going to check for this error code, which means that it's not found. Then we'll load the 404. Some other error, then we're just going to send a 500. If it's successful, we'll send a 200 response. And we're going to send the HTML file, and we're going to, oh, I'm sorry, I did this wrong. It should not always be HTML. It should be whatever the content type is. Good thing I did that. Okay. I think that, yeah, that should be right. And then we're going to finally just send the content of the file. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this. And I think it should work, hopefully. Let's go back, let's reload about, okay, and let's go to the home page, and that was about.html. And then we get welcome to the home page. Now, we should be able to also include CSS files. So in public, if I say new folder CSS and new file style.css, and let's just do body, we'll say background dark color white, and let's reload. Oh, we get include it. So back in index.html, let's say link to ./css/style.css, and we want this on all pages. So let's save this, go to about, paste that in, save it, go to 404, paste that in, save it, reload, and you can see the CSS is working. So if I go to about.html, that works. Now if I go to something that doesn't exist, like whatever, we get our 404 page. Okay, so it's working nicely. And if I open up the network tab and reload, you'll see that the document is, we get a 200 response. It's a text HTML, and if we want to look at the CSS, it's a 200 response, and the content type is text CSS. So you want to make sure you're giving the right status codes, you're giving the right content types, because now you're working server side. Okay, if you've been working as a front end developer with React or Vue and so on, you probably have been just on the side that is making the request, but now you're actually serving the response. Okay, so learning about HTTP is essential. All right, so I think that's pretty much it. Obviously, this isn't really like a project or anything, like a website or application, but I wanted to just get into the specifics of Node and some of the core modules and so on. So the last thing I'd like to do is just a simple deployment to Heroku. And the main thing to remember as far as the code that we've written is the port. You want to use this process env port. Okay, you also want to make sure that you have your start script as node and then index or whatever your main file name is. Okay, because Heroku is going to look at those things. Now, in order to push to Heroku, you need to sign up for an account. Let's go to Heroku.com. And you just want to sign up. I already have an account, so I'm just going to log in. And if you just create an account, you won't see anything here, but all your apps will show up as these weird names here, unless you rename them. But you're going to need the CLI tool. So if you search for Heroku CLI, just Heroku CLI, and click the first link, download and install. And if you're on Mac, you can download the installer or use Homebrew. Windows, use the installer, Ubuntu, and then other installation methods as well. But you want to get that installed. Okay, once you have it, let's go ahead and stop our server with Control-C. Okay, once you have it, you should be able to say Heroku -- version. I believe I have it installed. Yep. So if you have it installed, it'll show. And then you're going to want to log in through the terminal. So let's say Heroku login. So I'm going to use my email and password, which I believe that's it. Okay, so now I'm logged in. Now the way that we the way that we push to Heroku is with Git. So you need Git installed. If you don't have Git installed, just go to git-scm.com. Go ahead and download and install it. Make sure you have it. Okay, and then we want to initialize a Git repository. Now, I don't want to push my Node modules folder. In fact, I don't want to push my reference or anything like that either. So I'm going to create a new file here called .gitignore. And this is not a, hold on, gitignore. This is not a Git tutorial, so I'm not going to, go over everything about Git. I do have a crash course if you're interested. However, we can put Node modules in here to prevent it from getting pushed. Also, reference, I don't want that getting pushed, or logger.js or person.js. We don't need those. We just want the main site, the main server we created. Okay, so now let's do git init to initialize a repository. Let's do git add all. Let's make a commit. So git commit -m, and let's say initial commit. Okay, so once we have that done, we can then say, let's clear this up, we can say Heroku create. Okay, so with our account, it's going to create a new app, and it's going to give us some weird domain name. And if I go back to my dashboard and reload, you'll see that limitless meadow. That's what it created. So next thing we want to do is click on that and go to deploy, and just grab the command to add this as our remote repository. So this right here, we want to copy that and then paste that in our terminal. Okay, so now that's added as a repository. We already did the add and the commit. Now all we have to do is push to Heroku master, to the master branch. So let's say git push Heroku master. Okay, and this is going to push our application to Heroku, sets any environment variables that it needs. Okay, so build succeeded. All right, so now you can go to the URL, or you can just do Heroku open, and that will open it in your browser. And there it is. So as you can see, this is now deployed to the internet, our Node.js app. So if I go to /about.html, there's our about page, If I go to something that doesn't exist, 404 not found. All right, guys, so I know this was a long video. If you stayed till the end, I genuinely really appreciate that. I really do. If you can spend an hour and a half watching a video of mine, I really appreciate that. So thank you. And hopefully you got something from this. Even if you've used Node in the past, hopefully you picked up a couple things at least. But thanks for watching. Again, I appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.